This is Owen Palmer for Sonicstate, here to look at Quantum by Wavesfactory. Now, this is an interesting plugin. It splits the incoming signal into an attack portion and the sustain portion. I'll give you a quick example. So I have a crash sample in here. Here's the attack portion and the sustain portion. And once you've split the signal, or it has split the signal internally, you then have a selection of 16 of these lovely effects that you can put in separate racks. So you have a rack for the attack portion, which obviously the effects will only apply to that initial attack and not to the sustain. And then you have the sustain rack, which allows you to add effects that will only affect the sustain and not the attack. So let's have a look at that quickly. So I have this chorus on here now. Let's turn the speed up. And then, of course, without the solo on, we're now listening to an attack portion with this boost on the EQ and the sustain portion with the chorus. And of course, you can stack up to 16 of these effects in each rack. That's the basic concept. Now let's have a look at some other sounds that we can do using Quantum. Okay, so I have here this basic dance kick drum from a drum machine. First port of call is to perhaps figure out how much of the signal should be classified as attack and how much should be classified as sustain in the split. Now we do that with the decay control in the middle of the interface. So if I solo the attack, I can pull this to the left to get a shorter attack, which in turn makes the sustain portion longer because the crossover is earlier. Or I can drag this to the right, making the attack longer and the sustain shorter in the sense that the crossover comes later. Now let me figure out where I want to cross this over first of all. Okay, that's a nice enough point. And you'd actually be surprised. I mean, you can just use the volume controls to kind of re-level the attack and sustain portions, much like many of the transient shapers on the market. But really where Quantum comes into its own is the 16 DSP effect. I would say that the EQ is possibly the most universally useful effect of all the 16, despite the others being more interesting in other ways, perhaps, for creative endeavors. But for mixing, certainly the EQ takes on a new meaning now that we can affect just the attack and the sustain portions separately. So let's look at the attack on this first of all. So you can see that by doing this kind of EQ, I've given the attack a little bit more presence, a little bit more clarity. And maybe I can affect the sustain with a separate EQ and focus more on the body. Let's bypass the whole plugin to see what we had before and afterwards. Now, obviously, you could spend more time tweaking that and you might have other ideas about what you want to do with it. But I can tell you, just the EQ alone makes this plugin really super, super powerful. This is something that some people have been doing for a while in audio, splitting samples and using two channels. And I mean, that can be a bit finicky, especially as if you're having to then recombine those into a group channel or resample those to use them as one sample. Obviously, anything that comes out of Quantum is then one unit. So you can do all of your processing on attack and sustain separately within Quantum. And then you're free to treat that sound as if it had always been one sound from that point on. Now, perhaps the most interesting module inside Quantum is the enhancer, which is based on the technology found in Spectre by Wavesfactory. What this does is it looks a bit like an EQ. It will have two shelves in this version, so it's a cut down version of the full Spectre product. But what this does is, instead of just boosting the EQ as normal, it's essentially adding a distortion signal to that band. So it's like it's distorting this band and mixing that distortion with the dry signal to give a sound that's a little bit crisper than a normal EQ, hence why it's called an enhancer. Let's try it now on these hi-hats. I quite like that. That's just on the attack portion. I think the attack's still a bit dirty, so I'm going to follow that with an EQ. And now the mid-range on the sustain is really standing out to me, so I'm going to go and attack that with an EQ. Now the sustain has lost a bit of energy, so I'm going to compensate for that by increasing the overall level of the sustain. Let's toggle the bypass on and off to compare where we started with where we are now. I quite like that. I think that's quite nice. It gives it a bit more presence. Certainly it's a sound that's only really possible to do that quickly using Quantum. Now, something to keep in mind, because Quantum works with transient detection, Quantum doesn't really have a use with non-transient material. So obviously if you have something like long drawn out strings, there's no attack transient for Quantum to latch onto, and you're likely to get weird results. Ultimately, it's probably not the right tool for that job. So really we're looking for percussive sound. So that could be pianos, it could be plucked instruments, and certainly percussion and drum sounds. You do get a few controls to help you identify the transients. So have a listen to this bass sound. Now, if I solo the attack, just to isolate that so we can hear what Quantum is detecting, you'll notice it's not quite perfect. It's missing some of the transients, and it's clicking sometimes when there's not meant to be a transient there. So we have this sensitivity control that first goes to 0 and then it goes to minus 100%. Now, the 0 still does something. As does the minus 100. Although that seems to be a weaker algorithm. We also have the controls here for different types of input signals. So we have drums, general. Drums is default, by the way. General and soft. So let's have a try with these. This is on general. It's not quite getting all of the notes. I'm adjusting the sensitivity. And that's basically a no-go on general mode. Let's try on soft mode. Again, it's not grabbing it. Now, I just want to point out, I'm not saying this is a big flaw of Quantum. In fact, I deliberately chose this bass sound, knowing that it's not a particularly transient bass sound. To the human ear, yes, you can hear where each note starts, but I've tried this same sound with a whole heap of different transient shapers on the market, and none of them performed better than Quantum. So that's really important. It's because the program material itself, the source instrument, doesn't have much of a transient for the software to latch onto. So that's not really an indictment of Quantum per se. It would have been nice, in my view, to have had a MIDI input or something so you have an alternative method to indicate to the software where the transients should be, where the notes should fall, because maybe you do have an instrument like this, and I have that in MIDI, so why could I not just feed it with a MIDI signal? That's a technique that has been known to work. I use that with Shaper Box by Cable Guys or LFO Tool by Xfer Records. So in those cases, you don't necessarily use transient detection to use that software, but you can configure them to respond to MIDI triggers. It would have been nice to have seen something like that here. So I have another bass sound here that has a more percussive attack. Well, I'm satisfied with that. So as you see, it's not the bass line that's at fault. It's not the fact that it's bass. In fact, I have this still in drums mode for the detection and with the sensitivity set to 100%, which is the default position. And now let's have a look at some of the creative uses. So now that I have separate attack and sustain, maybe I could EQ those separately, first of all. And let's look at the sustain EQ. Since the sustain is quite resonant and long, whereas the attack is more knocky, doesn't really have the notes ringing out, it might be a good idea to use reverb. In fact, let's compare the difference between reverb on the attack versus reverb on the sustain. So I'll just load the default reverb setting on both the attack and the sustain. I'll deactivate it on the sustain first of all. Let's hear that just on the attack. And now let's compare that with the reverb just on the sustain. You can hear clearly it's a very different sound. I like that more so on the attack, and I'm going to tweak the reverb to be more suitable. Now let's try a chorus maybe on the sustain. I'd like to try this delay on the attack. And it's occurred to me that I could even solo the attack and mess around with the decay time. See, I quite like that. That feels like it's given me some creative scope that you wouldn't normally get with just a sound that's in audio. That's a sound that's in audio. It came from a synth at one point, but I'm now making it sound like synth automation or similar to synth automation just within here, which is, that's really quite unique. I've enjoyed that. Ultimately, I think Quantum by Wavesfactory, it's going to be very useful for me as a mixing tool and a sound design tool. I think Other people will find it more useful as a creative tool, so I think probably that's where it will be most popular. Looking at strengths and weaknesses, I think that it does a very good job of splitting the attack and sustain. Obviously, it can't be perfect 100% of the time. As I said, I wish it had MIDI implementation so that we could sort of circumvent that. I'd also have liked to have seen on the EQ, it would be nice to have a spectrum display, but that's probably asking a bit much, because I suppose Quantum isn't primarily designed as a mixing tool. It's really more for creative stuff, and that makes sense. That's fine. So, I'm Owen Palmer with Sonicstate, and I shall leave you with the sounds of Quantum by Wavesfactory.